Hello my friends and welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat, the show where I have tangent-filled conversations with different guests each week to talk about their passions and what excites them, all in my personal quest to find the most interesting conversation possible. And this week's passionate person is none other than Douglas Vincent. Now you may know the name Douglas Vincent from prior episodes. I spoke to Lena and Louise, who are members of the Douglas Vincent System. Douglas Vincent is an individual who has DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder. Now, if you want to know all the ins and outs of dissociative identity disorder, including some of the myths and misconceptions around it, please tune into the episode with Lena, where we go into that, and then also the conversation with Louise, where we delve even deeper using the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator Personality Test. But for this conversation, myself and Doug don't really speak about those things. This conversation is centered all around Star Wars. We just speak in depth about the original trilogy, the dark years of Star Wars, where there wasn't really anything coming out, the comics, the books, how Douglas kind of dealt with the prequel trilogy, the sequels, and then we kind of finish off by speaking about which characters in Star Wars are perceived to have traits of dissociative identity disorder and what Douglas thinks about all those. But that is enough from me, my friends. Just make sure you like this video, leave your comments, tell us what you think about this. Please subscribe to the channel because it really helps the show out. Tell your friends about it, and also don't forget, if you're a real audiophile and you want to hear the audio versions of all these, you can find it on Spotify or any podcast app, just Genuine Chit-Chat, for all of the content that I've released on there over the sort of 7+ years of doing this. But friends, thank you so much as always, and I give you my conversation with Douglas Vincent.
You're listening to Genuine Chit-Chat. This show is for real.
So, I am here today with another member of the Douglas Vincent DID System, Douglas Vincent himself. It's an absolute pleasure to have Douglas on here. Details are going to be in the show notes about prior times I've spoken with members of the DID System. I spoke with Louise back in episode 248, and I spoke with Lena in episode 235. So if you want to if you want to know all about DID and all those kinds of things, check out those episodes. The details are in the description. But this time, I'm speaking with Douglas about Star Wars and nerdy things and that kind of stuff. I imagine a bit of DID might get sprinkled in there, but this is primarily going to be a conversation for the nerds. So I want to ask Douglas, just out of interest, why did you want to speak to me? What was it about my conversations with Lena and Louise that made you think you want to jump on the mic and have a natter?
Well, the main thing is I've been dying to actually record a podcast where I'm just talking about Star Wars because, you know, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and I know from your podcast that you're a huge Star Wars fan also. You know, you have a whole separate podcast about Star Wars comics and canon, you know. So.
No, totally. I mean, the conversations, these would be going on YouTube, like the video versions of them. But anyone who checks out any of my other conversations, you'll be able to see there's loads of like Star Warsy stuff all behind me, and so I am definitely a massive Star Wars fan. So we'll start off. It's a question I quite like to ask, I guess, when Star Wars comes up. But what is Star Wars to you? And you can answer that as specific or ambiguously as you'd like. Just if I say, what is Star Wars to you, what's kind of the first thing that you want to answer with?
Well, wow, that's a big question.
It's a very small question with a very big answer. I like answering. People give very, very different answers, and I always think it's quite a good way to almost ice break. I mean, I don't need to ice break with you, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I guess Star Wars is just cool sci-fi fantasy thing that I've always been obsessed with since I was a little kid. So I don't know. I don't really remember a time in my life that I wasn't obsessed with Star Wars.
Same, to be honest with you. Well, so what was it like for you, sort of growing up around Star Wars? Like, what the great memories of Star Wars? Like, I know specifically you want to talk about sort of growing up with it. You know, I'm a prequels baby, so I grew up. You know, Megan has often said on podcasts as well, where it's like, when she thinks of Star Wars, she thought of Darth Maul because he was, you know, advertising everything for the prequels. And I've never, you know, in memory, I remember seeing Phantom Menace and I remember seeing Attack of the Clones very vaguely. But for me, the prequels have kind of always existed, which obviously shows my age. So it's a very different experience to a lot of people. Even people only a few years older than me then remember before the prequels and post-prequels. So with you growing up with Star Wars, how did you find it? Why did it connect with you? And just tell us all about your Star Wars journey.
Well, I obviously don't remember when the first Star Wars came out because I was less than a year old at the time.
I wasn't asking your age there.
Yeah. But yeah, I was less than a year old when the first Star Wars came out. So I don't remember when Empire Strikes Back came out either. but I do remember seeing it in the theater. But I'm pretty sure it was like re-releases when I saw it in theater when I was a kid. Because back in those days, before VHS was a really big, huge thing, there were movies got re-released a lot more often than they do nowadays.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm pretty sure I remember when I remember seeing Empire Strikes Back in the theater was re-releases. But the first one I remember seeing for the first time in the theater was Return of the Jedi, and that was like almost a religious experience. Like it was like a brand new Star Wars movie coming out. It's like because I was already obsessed with the first two by that point, and I was obsessed with the toys and everything, and I was always excited when they came out with new action figures and new vehicles and stuff, and always asked for everything for Christmas, and didn't usually get most of it, but but yeah, I had quite a bit of Star Wars action figures and everything, but some of the bigger things I never ended up getting, like the AT-AT and stuff like that.
Well, that was the gold standard. Trying to get some of the really big toys, you know. It's like you can have a little small figurine here and there. What about the big one? No, that costs far too much money.
Yeah. So
you got the figurines, and you had, and you remember seeing a sort of Return of the Jedi, and that really. So, out of interest, was Return of the Jedi at that point? Was that then your new favorite of the trilogy, or like how did that kind of when those first three were out? Did you have a favorite? Did you just kind of flip between them? What was your call for you?
I'm not really sure if I had a favorite when I was a kid, but I know now with my favorite is Empire Strikes Back, and I don't think anything will ever change that at this point.
Cemented in.
Yeah. But I think part of the reason why that's my favorite actually is because of something that happened when I was a kid that kind of cemented Empire Strikes Back's legendary status in my mind. Because okay, in order to fully get the full effect of this story, I have to first explain. Back in the days of VHS recordings, if you wanted to tape something from one VHS to another, you had to hook up your VCR to another VCR and play one tape on the one VCR while you're recording it on the other one. And at the time, my parents didn't really want to buy the movies. They preferred to get copies of them, you know, because it was cheaper. But because there were so many movies that me and my siblings wanted that, you know, it was a lot cheaper to just get copies of them. But I had found out about this, that you could make a copy by hooking up two VCRs together. And so I had begged my dad to my uncle's VCR so he could do this, and we could rent it from the video store and get a copy of Empire Strikes Back, because we'd already had a copy of the first movie, A New Hope. Of course, it wasn't even called that back then, but
just Star Wars.
yeah. But we didn't have a copy of Empire Strikes Back, so I begged my dad to borrow my uncle's VCR and hook everything up, and so he reluctantly did that because he didn't like hooking things up and everything, and it took him a while to hook everything up, and there was some cussing involved, I'm sure, and yeah, and finally he got everything hooked up and he got everything recorded and everything, and so I was ecstatic. I finally had a copy of Empire Strikes Back, but then after a few times of watching that, there was one day I sat down to watch it again, and I was watching through, and all of a sudden, about halfway through, like right after the bounty hunters first showed up on the Star Destroyer, and I think it was right after the line where the Imperial officer says, "Bounty hunters, we don't need their scum." Right after that, all of a sudden there's a, and then there's a. Yes, my dad recorded an episode of Knight Rider over the last half of Empire Strikes Back.
And you recognize that theme tune.
Yeah.
Good old Hoff.
Yeah. And I was a huge fan of Knight Rider as a kid. And I still think that the Knight Rider theme song is like the absolute best theme song ever. But this was Empire Strikes Back. This was sacred. You know, I was really angry at my dad for that. And I do believe him that there was an accident. I know he wouldn't do that on purpose, you know, but I begged him to borrow my uncle's VCR again and record it again. And he's like, "No, I'm not going through that again." So from then on, when I went to watch Empire Strikes Back, I was only able to watch about the first half of it. So then, whenever I went over to a friend's house and they had Empire Strikes Back, I was like, "We have to watch this. We have to watch this," because I had to see the second half again. So, so I think that's part of the reason why that's my favorite, is because the legendary second half is like.
That's so funny. It's funny because Megan has something not dissimilar where she works in a secondary school as a teacher, for any listeners who aren't already aware, and so she teaches sort of 10 to 16-year-olds, and she's a languages teacher, and so when it gets near the end of term, or they've had lots of tests and things and they need a bit of a break, especially towards the end of term or near sort of Christmas, it's often like the last lesson or so, a couple of them, it'll be, right, we'll do a short bit of like an activity, but then certain classes, if they're ahead and etc., they can then watch a bit of a movie, normally, related to things with, she's primarily a Spanish teacher, so often it's Coco bit with the Spanish audio and films like that. But she says, like, there's certain films, Coco, Book of Life, I think Ferdinand, where she's seen the first sort of 40 minutes so many times now, because you show it to a class and they watch it, and then the next class go, and then they obviously want to watch it film from the start again as well. So she's just seen the first half of this collection of like 5 films, and if she ever gets past a certain point, she's like, this is really weird. It feels like the film should stop here, even though obviously narratively it wouldn't, but because almost the visual memory of it doing that a lot. So I imagine with you, it was like when it got to the bounty hunters bit, your brain was almost ready for it to go, and the Knight Rider theme. But then when you saw it didn't happen, it was almost like, huh? What? I imagine that was a bit like it for you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's joyous. And then after, with Return of the Jedi, after that came out and things, what happened with your sort of love of Star Wars? Did it continue? Did you eventually get into certain the comics or the books or anything? Did it taper down for a little while and then come back when the special editions were re-released? Like, what kind of happened after your first sort of memories of those first 3 Star Wars films?
Yeah, I definitely still love Star Wars after that. But yeah, following Return of the Jedi became kind of what now a lot of people refer to as the dark years, or there wasn't really a whole lot of new Star Wars content coming out. There was Ewok movies, which I loved as a kid. I was still young enough at that time that I really liked them a lot, and we taped them off of TV and I watched them over and over. And then when the Ewoks cartoon and the Droids cartoon came out, I was watching those, and those I was starting to get a little bit old for the target audience of those at that time, but I still enjoyed them. I think I definitely enjoyed the Droids cartoon more than the Ewoks one, because the Ewoks one I think it was a little bit more kiddish. I think, if I remember right.
Yeah, it does have those kind of vibes.
Yeah, but yeah, and then after that I was like pretty much starving for Star Wars content and not getting much, and but I was I still had my action figures and everything, and although one thing that happened when I was in 6th grade, that I still regret to this day, is that I suddenly decided I was too old for toys, and I decided to sell a bunch of my toys in a garage sale, and my mom actually tried to talk me out of it, to her credit.
Wow, that's rare. Nobody's the other way around.
Yeah. But yeah, she said, "You'll regret this later," and sure enough, I did.
Still to this day, I imagine some of those might have been worth a bit of money now.
There were a few that I kept, but not very many. There was just a handful of that I kept. But
I have the same. There's certain like video games I had when I was younger. Like the old. There's one I remember, which is, it's not that old. It was Futurama on the PlayStation 2. The game sucked. You could complete the whole thing in like 2 hours. It was not a good game. It was awful. And I got it because I'm a big Futurama fan. Got it, sold it pretty soon after completing it for a few quid. And now it's worth like hundreds and hundreds of pounds, because it was basically, they didn't make very many. And then obviously no one liked them because the game sucked. But because they were so limited and they were like, well, we don't need to make any more of these, they became a collector's item and now worth loads of money. And I'm like, and it's happened with a few other games as well I've looked at, and I'm like, if it's the hindsight. I say to Megan, I'm like, I know I need to keep these because he's going to be valuable one day. And she's like, I don't think they will be. It's like, but they might. And if I get rid of them, I suppose that's a hoarding mentality. But I'm like, there's certain things around me, collectibles and etc., which I think, if they don't go up in value, they're still good for me. But I think, that it's a hard line trying to think I want to clear stuff out and be good with that. And also I want to keep things in case in 20, 30, 40 years, they're going to be worth something. Oh, so with that, so you had the dark ages, the dark times of when there there was some Star Wars content coming out, but it was few and far between, and it was pretty much just spin-offs, wasn't it? There wasn't, well, I've seen quite a few bits and pieces of everything you just mentioned, and it's like, none of it is like true the Star Wars. It's a side thing. So did you get into sort of, when we get into sort of the later in the 80s and the early 90s, once the Star Wars publishing really picked up after Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy, and then once that kind of made more and more and more, you've got the X-Wing books and etc., and the video games as well, sort of in the 80s and especially in the 90s, the video games of Star Wars really picked up. So was there any of that kind of content before any more movies came out that had grabbed you, or was it when the prequels came out that you kind of jumped back on?
No, I was definitely into the heavy end of the comics and the books and everything. In fact, I still remember to this day when I first went into the comic shop and noticed that the Dark Empire comics there on the shelf, and I was like, oh, new Star Wars comics, I must have these. And I bought it immediately, and I was eating it up. It was like manna from heaven. But yeah. And then the Heir to the Empire and all those Timothy Zahn books and everything, I was like, this was just great. This is like, it was the first thing that since Return of the Jedi that really felt like real Star Wars, because like you said, those Ewok movies and the Ewoks and droids cartoons didn't really feel like real Star Wars. They were kind of like more kiddish, and but yeah, I was like, yes, it's back. And at that time, we still, it seemed like a faint hope that we would ever get the prequel trilogy, because George Lucas had been talking about it for years and years and years, and nothing was happening. So at that point it was like, this was all we had, was the comics and the novels and everything, and so yeah, I was not necessarily buying every single one, but I was reading just about all of them, because I was getting a lot of the novels from my local library and everything, and reading them, and yeah, I was reading like almost all of them. There were a few that I didn't like. A lot of the X-Wing series I didn't read, because I'm not really as much into the military aspect of Star Wars. I'm more into the Jedi and stuff, and that kind of stuff. And also, I don't care as much for reading about space battles. I love watching a space battle on the movie, but reading about it just kind of doesn't seem the same.
I'm in agreement with you. I hadn't read, so I got into Star Wars reading really since it was around the time the Canon reset in 2014 with Disney. That's kind of when after my dad passed away, and shortly thereafter Force Awakens got fully announced with a teaser trailer and etc. And then a friend of mine bought me a Dr. Aphra comic, and so he bought me that in 2015. He just a couple of variants as like a birthday gift, and I hadn't read any Star Wars comics at all. So when I started reading, I've been reading a lot of the canon stuff and going back to Legends, or back to what was the expanded universe. And so I've now read, the Heir to the Empire trilogy and the Darth Bane trilogy, and I've read quite a few of the heavy hitters of the Legends books. Not all of them, because there's so many. But when I read the X-Wing book, and I listened to the audiobook of it as well, I enjoyed it. But I find it hard. I'm a very visual person, but I find it quite hard to conceptualize when they're talking about a ship in space flying around another ship in space. And when it's like, oh yeah, the aft wing was tilting towards this direction, and then the ship span counterclockwise, and then the reverse thrusters went on, and I'm like, you've already lost me. And when it's that for 5 or 6 pages, I'm like, but I'm like you, I love watching
it's like,
space
which way
battle.
is starboard again?
Exactly. So what was some of the, obviously Heir to the Empire, absolutely iconic, one of the top tiers, but were there any novels or comic things or anything that specifically you can remember as really enjoying at that time?
Yeah, I definitely remember really enjoying all the Dark Empire, all the sequels to that and everything. And like I said, anything written by Timothy Zahn, I was definitely there for. And I don't know. I've read so many of them that just bits and pieces that here and there that kind of stick out. I really loved the Tales of books, like the Tales from My Slice of Cantina and the Tales of the Bounty Hunters.
The anthology kind of ones where you've got they're quite cool. They've tried
those.
In the canon. They've tried doing a few of those kinds of ideas a little bit. So do you generally like anthology stories, or is it just in the Star Wars universe that kind of spoke out to you?
Yeah, I do enjoy reading books of short stories and that kind of thing. But yeah, I also enjoy reading novels too. So
because I like short stories.
Either way.
It's one of those where, like, there's certain short stories I do like occasionally, but anthologies are something that this makes me sound like such a dick, but I'm like, with anthologies, both on screen or on paper, I'm like, when I read an anthology story I'm like, oh, that was amazing, but I wish I had more, but I can't because anthology. And then when I read one that's not that good, I'm like, oh, it doesn't matter because anthology. And unfortunately, I'm ruining it for myself because I'm going, either this is going to be, you know, something that's amazing and I won't get more of it, or it's going to be something that's mid. But the problem is that I don't feel that way about movies, even though that's what a movie is. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I'm literally a hypocrite in my own thinking of that. But when it comes to anthologies, there's the odd one that has clicked with me, but anthologies for me haven't always. But I will say in Star Wars, what I quite like is, because I think, although they do these in most anthologies, they're loosely a connected universe. I think in Star Wars, where it's like, one of the beauties of Star Wars, whether in Legends or Canon or both, is that you've got characters and there's like one version of them. You know, when you read like Marvel comics or, you know, Moon Knight or anything like that, it's that you can get different universe versions of them. You can get an alternate universe of this, an alternate universe of that. And there is a main through one, but authors are free to just create like an alternate version because they've got like thousands of universes. Whereas in Star Wars, it's really just canon and legends now. And so back then when you read, you know, the Tales from Mos Eisley Cantina, when it's got a story that talks about Boba Fett, you're like, oh, that's the Boba Fett from the movie. And then when you read, you know, more stuff like that about Bib Fortuna or, you know, the Cantina owner or something, then you're like, oh, when you see them in the film, then you're like, oh, that's that thing. So I can really see how like some of the anthology books would really click with you. But you said you read like the Jedi and stuff and the Force, and I'm in a similar boat as well. I very much like the Force element of Star Wars. That's probably one of the things that connects to me the most. Would you say the Force in general is the thing that connects you, or do you just like the more fantasy side of thing? Like, what do you think of that?
Well, I think part of the reason why I like Star Wars so much is because it's a combination of fantasy and science fiction, which because I really like both fantasy and science fiction, and so with Star Wars being a combination of both, I think that's part of the reason why it's my favorite franchise. You know, but yeah, I've always been really into the Force and Jedi and that kind of stuff, but I'm also into the other side of it too, like the bounty hunters and Han Solo and that kind of stuff. You know. But yeah, like I said, probably the part of it that I'm least into is probably the military aspect of it, like some of the fighter pilot stuff and some of the like stormtrooper stuff and that kind of stuff. Like, you know, that's probably the aspect I'm probably least into it about. But I do. Having said that, I do enjoy like the Bad Batch series. That's pretty good.
I love the Bad Batch series. Some of my mates haven't yet watched it because we're doing, you know, Clone Wars conversations, and when we finish that, we're then going to eventually delve into Bad Batch. I've seen it all, and I just think, for me, when the show was announced, I was like, okay, interesting choice to do a spin-off of those characters, but okay, I guess.
Yeah.
And for the most part, I think it's all right. I think it's pretty good. But then there's the odd episode, and you're like, oh, that's a deep cut in a good way. There's certain like standalone episodes, and like that, especially about war and soldiers, and like the idea of what does a soldier do when the war's over. Like that, when it's really well done in that regard, I do really like it. But yeah, in general, I don't gravitate to that stuff as much.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the fact that they were like telling the story of how the transition happened from using clone troopers to using other non-clone troopers. You know.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I quite like that because that was something, I think, especially when the prequels came out, that was something that caused quite a bit of confusion. I think especially, I know the prequels came out, the internet was technically a thing, but you know, before the internet became like as ubiquitous as it is now, like everyone's got it and stuff. I mean, even when I went to school and things, it wasn't quite, it was becoming more popular, more common, but it wasn't a guarantee that everyone had it in their home and stuff. And I think when that happened, then a lot of Star Wars connective tissue kind of made sense. But I think for a while, especially after Attack of the Clones came out, there was a lot of confusion about that. So I want to ask actually, so the prequels, we've kind of we've gone into sort of part of your journey and things like that, and we can obviously delve back into novels and etc. if desired, but we come to the prequels, which are obviously very, very divisive for a number of reasons I completely accept. I love the prequels, but they're not perfect in any way, especially not the first two. So how were you, as such a, you know, with a Star Wars fan that had grown up with the original trilogy and then read the novels and really like kept your fandom flame alive during the dark times, how were you? I assume you were super hyped when the prequels came out. And so what was it like for you, or even the special editions, kind of from that sort of really late 90s era of Star Wars? How was that for you?
Well, first of all, when the special editions came out, I was extremely stoked because it was a chance to see the original trilogy in the theaters again for the first time in a long time, since I was a kid, pretty much. So yeah, I was really excited about that. And once I saw them, I kind of had mixed feelings about it. I was like, there's parts of it I liked and parts of it I didn't like. And then, of course, the main thing I don't like about it now is the fact that they don't have the original version of it readily available. They like try to wipe it from existence and try to pretend it never happened. Which I think is more George's thing than it is Disney's thing. But from what I've heard.
Yeah, well, just to pause you there, online they've made a 4K restoration of, they're called the despecialized editions, so the original trilogy in 4K, and I, much like other people, am interested by I like, the special editions, they've got some cool stuff in it, but also it's nice to have the option for the despecialized. It's one of those things, I'm like, with Disney Plus, like, you've got so many different things on there, like, they would make such a killing if they somehow, maybe it was in the contract where Lucas just said you could never release these ever or something, because he did have lots of random, weird, specific things that he stood by. But what about the special editions did you not like as much? What parts kind of jarred with you a bit in it? Like, my friend Dave says that the song at the end really annoys him in Return of the Jedi, because how is everyone celebrating? How do everyone know about it? And also the Empire was like this ingrained 20-year-old government. Not everyone's going to be super happy it collapses. So I wondered if, like, you had the same opinion, or if, I love hearing people's opinions on the special editions, because everyone's got a weird little quirky thing that they just really do or do not like. And I love hearing it.
Well, one thing is, I was excited about the fact that they were putting the scene with Jabba back in the New Hope. But I was kind of disappointed with how Jabba looked in the beginning.
Yeah, in
and
they went
back. They went back since then and improved it a little bit. But yeah, especially in that original version that was released in theaters, it was pretty bad looking. Looked like a baby Jabba the Hutt.
Yeah, and his eyes were quite wide. It looked like it looked like when you go to like a cheap fancy dress place and you buy the Jabba the Hutt not official Disney costume, and it's just called like giant space slug. And I was like, it's so weird, because you're like, but you made Return of the Jedi. Just you've got the puppet there. Surely you could just kind of loosely remake the puppet, but they were just, it almost looks like someone remade it just from hearing what it sounded like rather than actually seeing it.
Yeah. And but probably the thing that bugs me the most, though, about the special editions is probably the fact that they took out the awesome song Lapti Nek from the Jabba's Palace scene and replaced it with a far inferior, in my opinion, song, Jedi Rocks, which why would Jabba the Hutt, who hates Jedi, have a song called Jedi Rocks playing in his palace? But and they have this really goofy looking CGI character singing the lead vocal, and it's like, this guy looks like Captain Caveman. I don't know if you're familiar with that character, but
I think I know the name. I'll have to look.
He was a cartoon character from the 70s. I was watching it in reruns in the 80s when I was a kid, but yeah, look up that character. He looks a lot like I think his name is Joe Yowza, which is kind of a dumb name also.
Yes, I remember Captain Caveman. I think the Flintstones and Captain Caveman, like a lot of the sort of Hanna-Barbera sort of pseudo, like around that era, I remember seeing a lot of characters like that as well, of like when you'd have, I remember that. That's so funny. I'd never made that connection, but that is so true. Oh man. But yeah, that song is one of those things where, like, I remember, because I had the Star Wars films on VHS, and I had them on VHS before they became specialized. Now I don't. I just have these special ones over there. But I remember when the song changed, and I was like, I thought, because I was quite young, I was just kind of imagining it, and then I remember on TV, on a channel called ITV over here, they used to, every Friday, they used to have like pretty much Lucasfilm or Spielberg stuff. So it would be like the 3 Star Wars films, then the Indiana Jones films, and then Jurassic Park films, E.T. and that kind of stuff. But it would be only a loop of a couple of months. So my dad would always be like reading a book or the newspaper or something, and on a Friday night, it would be Star Wars or Indiana Jones or something on. And I remember ITV would be playing the older version still after I'd got the special editions on, it might be on DVD, so the early 2000s. because I remember the Star Wars prequels being amidst the very first DVDs I ever had. And so I remember watching the DVDs and thinking, this is really cool and a bit different. And then I remember seeing them on TV and going, there's something here that's different. And when I was so young, and again, sort of pre-internet, I didn't even really understand what had fully happened. And then I just remember like the size Snootles, and it's the female singer in Jabba's Palace with the really long mouth thing. And I remember I'm like, I don't hate the new song, but I'm like, of all the things in the original trilogy that you can change, of all the things you could pay to have in or add extra scenes, and George Lucas spends a lot of the money and effort making a fun little kind of chilled out song, a really over the top, heavily CGI song for no real reason. And I'm just like, dude, what? I don't understand.
Yeah.
Oh man, what do you with the special editions? So you saw them in the cinema, and I imagine that was absolutely incredible, because I've still only seen, I think, from episode 3 onwards at the cinema, and I know they've been this year they did all of them in the cinema again, but I've just been so busy I hadn't had the chance. So you saw the special editions, that was awesome, and then we get to the prequels. So tell us, how was your prequel experience, especially Phantom Menace? And you can be honest, it's okay, I won't be offended.
Well, I think when I first saw it, I tried very hard to convince myself that I liked it.
A lot of people say that.
And and then later when I thought about it again, and I know I saw it more than once in the theater, but I wasn't one of those people that saw like 10 or 15 times anything like that. But I saw it at least twice, I think, in the theater, and then eventually it started sinking in that this was not as good as the original trilogy. And then when episode 2 came out, I liked that a little bit better. And when episode 3 came out, I liked that a lot better, actually. Episode 3 is definitely still my favorite of the prequels. But and there are parts of all 3 prequels that I like, but there are also definitely parts of all 3 that I don't like. And overall, it's I still think they're definitely not anywhere near as good as the original trilogy. But yeah, I really like Darth Maul in the Phantom Menace, and I kind of wish they would have survived to be in the second and third, which, as we know now, he did survive, but that was kind of a after the fact retcon,
100%. Lucas just could do almost anything when it was Clone Wars. He's like, yeah, Anakin had an apprentice, did he? Yeah, why not? Oh, Maul's back, is he? Yeah, why not? It's like, okay, oh right. Maul is very cool. I love him, and I do think that. I mean, I love Count Dooku's great. Sir Christopher Lee does a smashing job, but I just think you could have just had Maul there. Like instead of just killing Maul, you could have made it seem like Maul was dead, and then the reveal in Attack of the Clones could have been you could have still had Sir Christopher Lee there playing Count Dooku, but you could have then had like Maul as the big bad, and then the reveal of it being Palpatine, even though it was super obvious because Ian McDiarmid. But like doing like and all the music and his head turns and every single bit of dialogue he says is almost just foreshadowing or almost telling the audience. But I feel like that could have worked quite a bit better. Although now we've got lots of cool Maul stuff. But yeah, so the prequels. So what were your thoughts of Jar Jar then? Because you said Darth Maul you liked, and yeah, I think the prequels, as much as I love them, I do generally love them. I think they trick people a bit because they often start okay, and normally the middle is usually the weakest, I find, for the prequels, especially Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. But then the ending is amazing. So you come out and go, that was actually really good. That was an amazing film. No, the last 40 minutes was amazing. The rest of it, bit of a mess. But I don't know if you had that same opinion, and any thoughts on Jar Jar?
My opinion on Jar Jar is that he's one of the worst things that ever happened to Star Wars.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always joke that the reason why episode 2 is better than episode 1 is because it has a lot less Jar Jar, and the reason why episode 3 is my favorite is because it has almost zero Jar Jar.
Yeah, that was very misguided. And it's one of those things where, like, I don't know if you've seen it, actually. I'll show you. People already at home will have already seen it. There it is. So Jar Jar Binks' head. And that's to scale. My friend got it for me as a joke because it's the when KFC used to have a life-size to scale Jar Jar Binks statues to advertise like Phantom Menace, and someone who worked there, they were going to chuck it away. Someone like kept it for a while, and then they moved, and then they cut the head off and decided to have the head on their wall, and then they moved out and wanted to get rid of it, and my mate bought it, and so now I've got a Jar Jar head. In my friends say I should put it on like a spike or something with like blood around it or whatever, but I haven't fully decided. I don't want to offend Ahmed Best if I ever manage to speak to him, because I'm like, I really don't like Jar Jar. I like him. I think he's great, and his performance was fine, but very, very misguided. Did you, when you first watched Phantom Menace, did you immediately, I always say this, jar with Jar Jar, or did you kid yourself and it took until the second viewing until you really realised you didn't like him?
I think I was starting to not like him from the beginning. Actually, there were a few moments that I thought were kind of funny, like when he gets his head in the pod racer beam, and but part of the reason why I thought that was funny is because I didn't like that character. So him getting electrocuted, I thought was funny. But yeah, it was pretty much from the get go. I didn't care for him. But
how did your with the prequels, because it was 3 years between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, another 3 years thereabouts to return Revenge of the Sith. Did you? Well, after watching Phantom Menace, were you still that excited to watch Attack of the Clones? Like, how were you going into Attack of the Clones compared to Phantom Menace, and then from there, Revenge of the Sith?
Well, basically, by the time Attack of the Clones came out, I was just hoping it would be better than Phantom Menace. which, and when I saw it, I was like, yeah, it is better, but it's still not as good as the originals. But I know a lot of people were like hating on the Yoda versus Count Dooku battle. I actually really like that. I really like the fact that we finally got to see Yoda fight, with lightsaber. The way that fight starts with just Yoda motioning like, "Come at me, bro." That was just awesome.
I love it. Yeah, I'm a massive prequel apologist. Again, not that they're flaws, but I love that Yoda stuff. But again, I think when you grow up seeing a lot of people, when they grow up seeing Yoda as the puppet Yoda from the original trilogy, they never expect him to go crazy and spinning around and jumping. And especially because when Phantom Menace first came out, obviously they did have puppet Yoda. So, and then I think when they changed to CGI Yoda and then obviously went back and edited Phantom Menace, so it was CGI Yoda in there as well, I think a lot of people did find that jarring. But for me, I'm like, I'm all up for anything crazy in Star Wars. I like crazy, weird stuff happening. And I'm like, it's a tiny little green man attacking Sir Christopher Lee with shiny light swords. I'm here for that. And then after Attack of the Clones, going into Revenge of the Sith, were you still optimistic, or how are you feeling then?
First of all, I want to say one more thing about the Yoda versus Dooku battle.
Do it, please.
People are hating. A lot of people hate the fact that he's jumping around and leaping around and stuff. But it's like, if you really think about it, if he wasn't jumping around and leaping around, what would that lightsaber battle have looked like? It would have been Yoda hobbling really slowly with one cane in one hand and lightsaber in the other hand, and Christopher Lee bending over to reach down to lightsaber duel against Yoda. It's like, was that what you would have preferred? I know I definitely wouldn't prefer that. I don't think.
No, I'm not up for that. I'm not up for the Yoda cane cut of Attack of the Clones. Yeah. But actually, we'll stick on Attack of the Clones for a bit, because what did you think of the Padme Anakin stuff? Because I know that was the main part that people didn't like about Attack of the Clones.
Yeah, that's probably the main part I don't like about it too. Yeah, because it was just so. It's not so much that I don't want romance in Star Wars. I'm not really against romance, but just the way it was handled, like the clunky dialogue and the weird. It was just off. It wasn't really romantic even. It was just weird.
On both parts, yeah. Very, very bizarre. It's one of the things I remember when I was a kid, when I had it on VHS, when it would get to the Anakin Padme stuff, I would just fast forward it. I want Detective Obi-Wan. I love Obi-Wan. Him going around with the Kaminoans and uncovering the clone army. All up for that. But that was great. I love, Ewan McGregor. I love Ewan McGregor anyway. But he, for me, is one of the main bits of the prequels that I really enjoy.
And the other part that I really loved about Attack of the Clones was the big arena battle with all the Jedi.
Oh, so good.
That was like a dream come true for a Star Wars fan. Like to see that many Jedi in one place battling a bunch of droids, and it was just awesome.
Yeah, because I think that's the most Jedi we've seen on screen. at any one time, really, on like with their lightsabers out ready to go, ready to fight. Like, I think that's the biggest Jedi involved action scene we've seen. And that for me, I mean, I do prefer Attack of the Clones to Phantom Menace, just because basically the Padme Anakin stuff annoys me less than the Jar Jar stuff does. The Anakin Padme stuff is like 3 annoying long-ish scenes, but once that's done, it's kind of done. Whereas Jar Jar is like every 5 or 10 minutes, he just does something to annoy you. And so it's just like, there's almost no scenes in Phantom Menace or no periods of time in Phantom Menace after Jar Jar's first shown to him just going away. He's just always, every few minutes, he's on screen reminding you how annoying he is. Whereas at least the Padme Anakin stuff does kind of fade away a bit. But I know that also for a film, you sat there and you're like, oh, come on. I don't want to watch you float a pear to her or her trying to eat a pear, and then you float it back to yourself, steal a bit of it, and then float it back to her. Is this romance? Is this what love is? Anything else about, obviously we can still jump back, but anything else about Attack of the Clones or Phantom Menace?
I don't think so.
Let's go on to Revenge of the Sith. So how you said you preferred that, and I mean, I go back and forth, but Revenge of the Sith and Return of the Jedi are my 2 favorites, but Empire is incredibly close to that, and Last Jedi and Force Awakens are pretty close as well. It kind of depends on what day you get me, but generally Revenge of the Sith is actually my favorite, mainly because I love the ending and how horrendously dark it is from Order 66. So how do you find, like, with Revenge of the Sith, you go into that, your expectations weren't necessarily that high because of Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, and then you watch it in the cinema. Like, how was that for you? I
was just really relieved that it was the best one of the trilogy, because that was the one that I was really hoping would be the best, because, you know, I had been waiting pretty much my entire life to see on the big screen how Anakin turns into Darth Vader, you know, and there had always been rumors going around about that it involved volcano or, you know, lava planet or something like that, and it's like, because I think George Lucas had said something to that effect in interviews or something a long time ago. So yeah, there had always been that whole concept floating around about. So it was cool to see that concept coming to life on the big screen, you know, and some of the things that I wasn't expecting that were added, like General Grievous and everything. I really like General Grievous a lot. And yeah.
What about Order 66? How'd you feel about that? Did you expect and the bit where like, Anakin kills the younglings, like? That's it's pretty brutal. I know Star Wars has some more adult moments, but when I saw that, I was like, Jesus, how do they get this in? Like, that moment where he ignites his blade and the kid takes a step back is like, phew. Every time I watch it now, it still gets me. So how do you feel about that sort of darkness and things?
Well, I knew that it was coming, because obviously they talked about it in the original trilogy about how Darth Vader helped to hunt down all the Jedi and everything, and so I knew that was coming. So it didn't really shock me that much, I guess, but because I knew that, you know, at that point Anakin had already turned to the dark side and everything, and so he was pretty much evil already. So, but yeah, it was kind of sad to see, you know, not just the younglings, but also some of the Jedi that I started to like, you know, that were showed up at the prequels, seeing them all killed off, you know, most of them, except for Yoda, you know, and Obi-Wan. But yeah, it wasn't really all that shocking, but it at the same time, it definitely was like, yeah, very, very dark. And I wasn't sure if I was really expecting them to show that part of it, as far as killing the younglings, you know. Mm-hmm. But
yeah, and with once you finished Revenge of the Sith, then, you know, a few years later, I mean, Revenge of the Sith was 2005. I think the Clone Wars movie came out in 2008. So I remember I saw it at the cinema and I was like, guess I'm not that into Star Wars anymore. And then I just kind of stuck to Star Wars via the games for a while. And then I kind of got back into it again once the sort of... I'd been playing games. There's a lot of games I love, you know, Force Unleashed and things like that would always have a special place in my heart. But I kind of... I think it was because 2005 is when Star Wars, the prequels ended, and then Doctor Who restarted. So I just shifted all my sci-fi fandom straight onto Doctor Who, and then and Doctor Who, you know, was the thing for me for several years, and then Star Wars got announced again, and I just kind of slowly swiveled back. So how were you once Revenge of the Sith, once the prequels had come out? That was when everyone thought, like, that's it, Star Wars is done, kind of finished. Granted, there was obviously going to be, you know, there was the Clone Wars, there was the micro series sort of between episodes 2 and 3, but then the Clone Wars series and the movie and that kind of stuff was happening, but Star Wars wasn't quite in the forefront anymore. How was, like, after Revenge of the Sith, how much Star Wars were you consuming? Did you then take a step back? Were you kind of doing other stuff, or did you watch the Clone Wars movie? Like, how was your kind of connection with Star Wars after the prequels?
Well, like I said, I've never really lost my fandom of Star Wars since I was a little kid. So after the prequels were over, I found other ways to get my Star Wars fix. Like they were still making more comic books and novels and that kind of stuff. I was still reading a lot of those. And the Clone Wars movie, I wanted to see in the theater, but I never got around to seeing it before it went out of the theater. But then when I finally saw it on DVD, I was glad that I had not seen it in the theater. I was glad that I hadn't wasted my money seeing it in the theater, because that, I think, is probably my least favorite Star Wars thing that I've ever seen.
Wow.
But including the prequels.
Mm.
And even including the holiday special, even, because the holiday special is bad, and it's really bad, but it's like one of those things that's like so bad it's good, It's like so bad that you enjoy laughing at it, As far as the Clone Wars movie, it's like not even that. It's not like you enjoy laughing at it. It's just bad, period. It's probably the one thing that I have seen once and probably wouldn't watch again. Everything else, there are some other Star Wars things that I've only seen once, but I would watch again, But that's probably the one thing that I probably wouldn't bother watching again.
Yeah, I rewatched it recently, and it's not as bad as I remember it being, but it's not great. It definitely doesn't stack up against the movies.
But then when the Clone Wars series came out, I gave it a chance, and I actually started liking it a lot, actually. And I really like the Clone Wars series, and I think that helped me to soften my feelings toward the prequels also, because it kind of filled in some of the gaps and helped with some of the things that didn't make sense in the prequel. Kind of help it make a little more sense.
Yeah,
fix some of the plot holes and that kind of thing.
Star Wars loves doing that, don't they? They love. It's like here's another bit of content, but that's a plot hole. Don't worry, we'll fix it soon. I mean, I love the Clone Wars series. Absolutely adore it. And then, did you watch Star Wars Rebels after that? I mean, if you've watched Bad Batch, I assume you've watched all the animated stuff.
Yeah, I didn't really watch Rebels until like way after the fact, after it was already over with. But I have watched all of Rebels. I think the only series that I haven't watched actually is the Resistance series.
Yeah, I wouldn't bother. It's one of those. There are some people who like it. I think most of those people are children. Sorry if any listeners really enjoy it, but like online, when I've seen people like it, pretty much anyone on like X who says they enjoy it, their profile normally shows they're like 20 or younger, and I'm like, okay, you probably watched it when you were like a teenager, or it's not. It's the only Star Wars thing where I started it 3 times. I have finished it. The way I forced myself to finish the series was I would do the dishes back before I had a dishwasher, before I had my lovely house, when I was still washing dishes by hand. And so Megan would cook, I'd do the dishes, and I would basically she would go to bed and I'd do it. And then I'd watch an episode of Clone Wars on a tablet sideways. And I'd just put it like on the windowsill, and I'd have nothing else to do but watch the tablet. And I was like, the first few episodes of Resistance are awful, or quite a lot of them are quite crap. And the first season is worse than all the Clone Wars stuff. But then season 2's got a couple of not bad bits in it, but you're not missing out. Don't fret. You or any listeners, if Resistance is the only bit of Star Wars you haven't watched, you can keep that as the only bit of Star Wars you haven't watched. And then we get to the sequels then. So, you were watching the animated stuff, you watched Rebels, and then obviously while you were watching Rebels, that was like when Rebels Think Series 1 came out, that's when the Disney Canon reset. That's when I think 2013, 2014 was when the deal was struck, or was maybe 2012, 2013. And then officially Disney started producing content from 2014. So then the sequels get announced. How did you find the sequels when you were seeing that in the cinema, especially The Force Awakens?
Well, first of all, when it first got announced that Disney had bought Star Wars and they were making more movies, I was like, yes, finally, more Star Wars movies, because I was, at that point, I would pretty much given up hope that there was ever going to be any more Star Wars movies from George Lucas, because he kind of, he had kind of vaguely hinted things that he might make more, but he seemed like he was done with Star Wars at that point, But I just didn't realize how done he was that he was willing to sell it, But that came as a shock to, I think, everybody. I was like, Disney bought Star Wars? Like, what? And in fact, at first I thought it was like, it's like if that news had been announced on April 1st, I definitely would not have believed it. It was that kind of thing. But yeah, I was really excited about the prospect of more Star Wars and everything. And when I saw Force Awakens, I really, really liked it a lot, actually. And I still like it quite a bit. And I'm one of the few people, I think, that actually at least likes all three of the sequel trilogy movies, because when it comes to Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, that it seems like everybody either loves one and hates the other. It's like if you love Last Jedi, you hate Rise of Skywalker, and vice versa. It seems like. But I actually liked all three of them, and actually, I know this is probably a controversial opinion, but I think actually Rise of Skywalker was my favorite of the three, actually.
Wow, my friend Tony, he has, Lena knows Tony. He absolutely adores that film. I don't know if it's his favorite of the three, but he genuinely, absolutely, he's a staunch defender of that movie. So at least you've got one other ally.
Yeah. But I would say it's probably my favorite Disney era Star Wars movie overall, though, is probably Rogue One. I really like that movie a lot.
That film's so good.
Yeah. Every
time I watch it, something more to like about it, and especially with Andor and stuff, which is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, that's so we've kind of gone across your Star Wars journey to a degree. Obviously, there's a few things we want to talk about as well before we wrap this up. I want to ask, I know you've got a couple of sort of DID connections, but I want to ask, I've only been asking this question of some people over the last year or two, and because you are a person of faith, how, if any, does Star Wars have a relationship with your faith at all? You could be as vague with that. Again, it's not dissimilar to my first question, but the reason I ask it is because I've got quite a few friends who say they are quite religious, and they find that, especially the ones who believe in more Abrahamic religions or in Christianity and things, obviously there's the whole Immaculate Conception kind of idea with Shmi Skywalker and stuff. There's a lot of chosen one, a lot of parallels to some of the biblical stories and etc. And also the Force, that's got its roots in sort of Buddhism and sort of other sort of more Eastern religions. I didn't know if Star Wars has a connection with you for your religion, or you see any parallels, or they're just two kind of important pillars, or even if you've even thought about that connection at all. I thought I'd throw that your way before you get into the other stuff you want to discuss.
Well, I definitely see, how George Lucas kind of pulled from different religions and everything. But I don't really see that much of a connection between Christianity specifically and Star Wars. I mean, to me, my Star Wars fandom and my faith are two separate things. And my faith is definitely, even though Star Wars fandom is a huge, huge part of my life, my faith is definitely more important to me because, my faith is the most important thing in my life, and everything else is second, third, whatever, to that. But yeah, as far as my secular interests, I think Star Wars is probably one of the biggest ones. But yeah, I don't really connect those two at all. Really, they're separate things.
Perfectly fair. I myself am not a religious individual, so I'm with me, I'm just always interested because everyone just has it in different things. Certain people have it in. Everyone has their own lens of Star Wars, which is one of the reasons I love it so much, which is, some people are much more into the books, much more into the comics, more into the sequels, originals, prequels. I think what trilogy you're into is usually quite heavily linked to your generation, or at least I don't think there's anyone who saw the original trilogy in the cinema whose favorite Star Wars trilogy is the sequels. Maybe there's a person out there who that exists for, but I've not met that person. Generally speaking, anyone I know who loves the prequels like I do or thinks the prequels are better than the original trilogy are generally millennials. Maybe a younger Gen Xer, but generally it's millennials. And then pretty much anyone I know who thinks the sequels are the best are pretty much always Gen Zers. So it's always interesting to me of like how people connect Star Wars to parts of their life. Like I've said on the podcast before, like, because my dad got ill and then passed away just before the sequels came out, and because I like Star Wars because of Dad, the things I've loosely spoken about in this conversation, I inadvertently basically imprinted. I basically, my grief from Dad, I essentially kind of turned that into a fixation on Star Wars, and I think, subconsciously that was like a connection to Dad. So, and I know other people have got sort of certain connections to it. So with you, I assume it's just like, without delving too deep into your childhood, but like Star Wars is a brilliant escape. it's such a rich, full world because, as you say, you know, it connects sci-fi and fantasy. I think the term is like space fantasy or space opera, that kind of thing. And it's such a rich lore. And I always say to people, the more Star Wars you consume, the more I find you enjoy Star Wars, the more books you read, the more comics and etc. So would you say that part of the reason you like Star Wars is because of the brilliance of the fantasy in the world, and it's really a world you can escape into?
Yeah, definitely. I think science fiction and fantasy in general has been a big escape for me a lot of times in my life, you know, because I've obviously being DID, that means that I had a very traumatic childhood. There was a lot of bullying that went on in my childhood and a lot of things like that. And so, yeah, the fiction that I escaped into was very definitely important to me for that reason. Yeah.
So when we get into, you had a couple of things about DID, some sort of connections that you found in Star Wars. You said some of them were not necessarily strong connections, but ones that you wanted to bring up. So the floor is yours, good sir. What kind of stuff do you want to tell us about?
Yeah, before I get into that, though, there's one other thing I wanted to talk about regarding the extended universe from pre-Disney era.
Do it, please.
Because it kind of annoys me that when I hear people talking about the pre-Disney extended universe, one of the things that a lot of times they bring up is when they reference how weird and crazy it was, is the fact that there was a force-sensitive droid. And so I wanted to set the record straight on that, because it kind of annoys me that people reference that as part of the extended universe, because that story was in a comic book series called Star Wars Tales, which I absolutely loved. But it was a series that was specifically intended to be non-canon, actually. It was kind of like the Star Wars Visions that they have now, the animated series, where people just, like, writers could just, like, go off and go crazy, you know. And that story specifically was kind of like a parody, like kind of a one-off, like, joke story, pretty much. And it was about R5D4, actually, and they called him Skippy the Jedi droid in the story, and he specifically made himself malfunction because he saw a force vision that R2D2 was going to be very important for the future of the galaxy, and so he made himself malfunction so that Owen would buy R2D2 instead.
Yeah, so, I've heard about that. The tales, because my friend Math, who I do Clone Wars conversations with, he saw one of the Star Wars tales where it was Darth Maul versus Darth Vader, and it was like, obviously we know that couldn't. I mean, technically now it could have been a thing, but that came out in '99, so that was the point where you thought Maul is gone. So the Star Wars tale. I mean, that one is. I think there was a Legends, like you've read a lot more Legends than I have. Would you say that? Did you think it's like? Was it a bit of a mess in certain respects, like continuity-wise, or did you not really notice? Like, I know certain authors were really good with their own, you know, certain, like, collections of novels, but because there wasn't, like, a necessary, like, story group trying to piece things together, did you find it was messy at all, or did you just think it was a massive sandbox?
There were times when it got to be kind of a mess, but it did. They did try to connect it all. Like they had different characters from different storylines pop up in different areas, you know, like certain characters would start off in the Jedi Academy novels, and then they'd show up in like some of the other novels and stuff, and so I actually was really impressed with how well they managed to keep everything straight and keep it. I mean, there were some continuity errors here and there and stuff like that, but yeah, I was actually pretty impressed with how well they managed to tie everything together for the most part.
Yeah, because I think Corran Horn's one of them. He starts in the X-Wing series, and I think he goes off into some of the Jedi Order books and things. And obviously like Mara Jade, I mean, she started in, you know, one of the pillars of the expanded universe of Heir to the Jedi trilogy. But I know that when I started reading Legends, I was like, yeah, I knew about Mara Jade, but I knew more about Mara Jade like towards the end. So I knew her being like Luke's wife and a Jedi Master and all this kind of sort of stuff. And then when I met her in Heir to the Empire, and I was like, oh, this is her origins. Oh, cool. And I just had a look online. I was like, how long till her and Luke get married? And it's like, oh, it's a long time. There's several novels. It's not just the fourth book is the marriage. No, it's a while. So like, was it hard? Like how did you know what books to read, or did you just go to the library and request them, or was there like a local like place you could go to and they just kind of knew the order, like, or did you just take what you could?
Well, basically, pretty much kept them in order because I was reading them as soon as they came out. As soon as they come out, as soon as the Star Wars book came out, I was right there at the library checking it out. A lot of times I would even put it on hold before it even came out. So so it really wasn't that hard for me to keep them in order because of that. Because I was reading them as they were coming out.
That's the way to do it. That's what I have to do with the High Republic books that are coming out at the moment. I'm like,
Yeah.
I've got them in I'm a little bit behind now, but I've got them in the stack of which order they're in. And now I see people like starting the High Republic books now, and they're like, where do you start? And it's like, you're asking a big question there. Just like, I've never seen Star Wars before. Which film do I start with? It's like, you say that question in a room full of nerds, and you're going to get 100 different answers.
Yeah, that's one thing that I haven't really kept up with the High Republic at all. I've read a few of the comics, but that's about it.
The comics are good, but they don't. The problem is the High Republic is the book behind me, that side, Light of the Jedi. It's almost like you can read, if you read that book, you can then kind of read anything, but it's frustrating because the comics are good. They're not phenomenal. Sorry, Cavan. I've had Cavan on the podcast, and I love his work, but they are really good. But for me, the novels are the biggest strengths of the High Republic era, in my opinion. But you do kind of have to read Light of the Jedi for the other ones to make sense. And Light of the Jedi it's a brilliant book, but it's so much to take in. There's so much going on. There's so many characters. But out of interest, like with your current Star Wars media consumption, so you watch Bad Batch, and I assume you watch sort of the live action shows as well. Do you read any of the books or comics? I know you mentioned you read the High Republic ones, but have you kind of kept up any of the Disney era reading?
I've read most of the comics, but I haven't read very many of the novels.
Fair enough. Well, if you need any recommendations.
Recent years, I've been reading a lot more comics than I've been novels lately in recent years.
Yeah, but there's plenty of good ones.
Yeah.
Amazing. So is there anything else you want to tackle before we do the DID perspective?
No, I think we probably ought to head into that since I don't want to take up too much of your time. So.
It's all good. No pressure at all. So what are these things that you want to tell us about?
Well, I just thought since your listeners already know that I'm part of a DID system, it might be interesting to kind of talk about some of the things, because there aren't really, as far as I know, there aren't any actual DID characters in Star Wars. Not to my knowledge. But there are a few things that are kind of like sort of DID adjacent a little bit. And one of those is when the Obi-Wan series was coming out, actually there was somebody in the Into the Night Discord server that was actually asking a question of Lena, that because he was saying, or they were saying, I can't remember who it was actually, but they were asking because they had heard some people online speculating after that speech that Vader gave when he was having the duel with Obi-Wan, and when his helmet had gotten smashed, and he was talking about how Anakin was dead, he killed him and everything, And this person was asking Lena because they had heard people speculating that this might mean that Vader has DID, that Vader and Anakin were two different alters in the system, And Lena's answer, and I think I would agree with her, was that no, he's not DID. Because for one thing, it wasn't really something that started in his childhood. It was later in life. And for another thing, I think the whole thing of Vader killing Anakin was more his own justification to himself, that his own reasoning to try to convince himself that Anakin was dead and the good side of him was dead. But as we all know from Return of the Jedi, that wasn't really true. That was just him trying to convince himself of that. And so I don't think Anakin was like a separate person, but it was just him trying to convince himself that the good side of him was dead, So, and then the next thing I wanted to talk about was there was this character in some of the pre-Disney novels. His name was Raynar Thule. I don't know if you heard of him.
No, I don't think I have, actually. Say his name again.
Raynar Thule.
I'll look him up while you tell us about him.
He was a character that was a Jedi. He had trained under Luke in his Jedi Academy, and but he at one point came into contact with these alien beings called the Killik, who were like a kind of insect kind of creatures that were kind of similar to the Geonosians. But these creatures kind of had a hive mind, kind of like similar like bees and that kind of thing. And they kind of absorbed Raynar Thule into their hive mind, and he became this character called Unu Thule. And he kind of became the leader of that that Killick tribe, and but he was their leader, but he was also part of the hive mind, and he referred to himself as we, and so he was kind of like he was multiple minded, and he was kind of like, and I think at one point Luke was kind of wondering if the original Ragnar Thor was still in there somewhere, and he claimed that it was Ragnar Thor was dead, and that he was this Uno Thor who replaced him, but Luke was still trying to get to the original Ragnar Thor and bring him back, and so it's kind of like, again, a little bit DID-ish, but not really the same thing as DID, really.
Because I'd not heard, because I've just looked it up, and so he's in the characters in the Young Jedi Knight series, and then he goes into sort of the Darkness books and the Legacy of the Force he's mentioned in, and then he's in the Fate of the Jedi books. So yeah, he's in a lot of the sort of later canon stuff, but later legend stuff, but I hadn't read about him at all. But I have heard people discuss the Anakin Vader, the thought of them being, I say it's hotly debated. I think generally most people agree with yourself and Lena that they're not the same, that they are the same person. But there's a percentage of the fandom who consider Vader and Anakin different people. But I agree with you. I think it's the same person, and I agree completely. I think what he was saying, and a lot of what Vader says, to be honest, I think a lot of it is him telling himself. It's him saying, yeah, I killed Anakin. There's no Anakin back. Definitely not. Because if there was, he would have to look at all the atrocities he's caused. And it's easier just to say, no, I killed the good guy. I'm a bad guy. I don't care about any of the bad stuff I did. I'm bad. And it's like, okay, I guess you don't have any guilt then. Whereas obviously if you're saying, yeah, I am Anakin, then it's like, well, why are you being such a dick? Why are you being so mean? So I completely agree. I think I agree with that. And I think it's interesting because the Obi-Wan Kenobi series, I enjoyed it. I didn't love it. I think I need to rewatch it like all in one go, because I watched it like week by week, and I think when doing that, it does highlight certain weaker elements of parts. But that final scene with Obi-Wan and Vader, it visually was stunning, and it does a homage to one of my favorite scenes and one of my favorite parts of all of Star Wars, which is the finale of season 2 of Star Wars Rebels, when you have Ahsoka and Vader and, part of the mask comes off. Like, I'm a sucker for that. I love it.
Yeah. And
then, so is it, like, I know we've got a smidge more time, so is there anything else as well? Because we've spoken DID stuff, and, that's really cool, and thank you for sharing. Is there any other sort of DID connections there? There
are actually a couple more that I want to talk about. One of them is that I remember when the first 2 episodes of Acolyte came out, there were people online that were speculating that maybe the twins aren't really twins. Maybe that's the DID system. And when we watched it, after the first episode, we were like, yeah, that could be actually. But then after we saw the second episode, we were like, no. Because in the second episode, they're actually show the two of them actually seeing each other for the first time since both of them thought the other one was dead, and it's like a lot of people still might think that could be DID because of the fact that there are a lot of fictional portrayals of DID that show them as seeing alters outside of their body, like hallucinations, but that really doesn't happen in DID in real life as often as they make you think it does in movies and stuff. It's a lot less common than what a lot of people think it is. So,
yeah, I think I recall from one of the conversations, I think it was with Lena, when she mentioned in the Moon Knight series with Oscar Isaac, I think it was like that's closer, where it's like it's still not fully represented, but it's like the internal world in that is much more accurate, but with kind of almost seeing, like sensing someone's there, and maybe seeing a reflection almost. That's closer, still not fully accurate, than just seeing an altar in front of you. It's really not like that. It's much more about the internal world where the altars like fully face each other and kind of communicate in more depth, if I'm understanding.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, throw some more connections our way.
The last one I wanted to talk about was there was this character that is often commonly referred to as Horse Pilot.
Okay. Oh, in the is it in the X-Wing series or Wraith Squadron? I think, because I've seen pictures.
Which I actually wasn't that familiar with this character until I heard about him on this other podcast I listened to called Star Wars Minute. I don't know if you heard that podcast.
Yes, I have actually. Yeah.
Yeah, but they were talking about him, and I think his name was like Hohas Equish or something like that. It was like very very obvious that they intended to make it sort of a horse pun, like equine, But that character, when I found out a little bit about him, it was very intriguing because he and I want to go back and eventually read those X-wing books because, like I said, that was part of the canon that I kind of like more or less ignored because of the fact that I don't like reading about space battles that much. But this character is very intriguing because it kind of, from what I've heard about him, he had like multiple minds, but it wasn't the same as alters really because they didn't have like separate names and everything, but they were just like one was his pilot mind and one was his diplomat mind or something, and like different like modes that he would go into. Like it was like, and he would also often refer to himself as we, in plural, but it wasn't like, it was actually more similar to like OSDD than DID actually, because OSDD is like it stands for otherwise specified dissociative disorder, and it's something that's very similar to DID, but not quite the same thing because, well, there's two different types actually. There's type A and type B, and I forget which one's which, but one of them is like similar to DID except for there's not as much amnesia between the parts, and then the other one is similar, but there's not as much formation of like specific identification of the different identities. Like they don't each have names and different appearances in the internal world and that kind of thing. They're just more defined by their roles and that kind of thing. So that's what I think this character is more similar to, is that type of OSDD where it's just kind of like there are separate parts, but they're more identified by their roles rather than actual having names and everything.
Yeah, that's interesting because I don't know. The reason I know about that character is because when the X-Wing that then kind of became the Wraith Squadron books, when they've been releasing Legends books under the Essential Legends collection, and I've got a few of them. I've got the Darth Bane ones, I've got the AT Empire ones, and they have like new artwork for the Legends books. And for the Wraith Squadron one, the horse-headed pilot, he's on the cover of one of them, and I saw like in some of the Star Wars communities I'm in, people being like, yeah, justice for whoever the character's name is, and being like, yeah, we'll finally get to see a bit more of him, because I think he was on the cover of one of the other books, but I don't think there's much art of him, so I think people were really excited. So I was like, oh, a horse-headed character, that's cool. So I knew about them peripherally from that, but yeah, I didn't know their name or anything else about them at all. So are you with what you're reading at the moment, then you say you're kind of reading the comics, are you still reading a lot of the Star Wars comics? Are you reading kind of other sci-fi fantasy stuff now? Have you kind of read most of what you were going to read with Star Wars? Are you waiting for anything to come out? I'm interested in what printed media of Star Wars you're consuming, if any, at the moment.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of the comics, but I'm a little bit behind. But I'm trying to catch up on Marvel Unlimited. But I've been the only one that I'm actually buying is the Star Wars, like the main title, the one that's just called Star Wars.
Yeah.
Because that's the one I'm most interested in, because it has, my favorite characters from the original trilogy, and it takes place during the original trilogy years and everything. And so, that's the one I'm definitely most excited about. But I've also really enjoyed a lot of the other ones too, like Darth Vader one. I've really enjoyed a lot. It's been really intriguing to see a lot of his, especially the issues that deal with his past, like with Padme and that kind of thing, like remembering Padme, and it kind of deals with his struggle with, not wanting to, like what we were talking about earlier, with him not wanting to admit that the Anakin side of him still exists, that kind of thing. And so I've really enjoyed some of those stories, and Dr. Aphra is just a ton of fun. I love that series.
Love Aphra so much. She is.
I love those murder droids in that series.
Yeah, my mates always talk about them. 000 and BT-1.
Yeah,
I literally,
they're hilarious.
It's I can't get enough of 000. I'm like, 000 and Dr. Aphra are my two most wanted characters from comics or books that I want on screen. Like, could you imagine like an animated series? Obviously, they'd have to wind it back a bit. But I think if they had an animated series with Dr. Aphra just going around being a rogue archaeologist and just kind of Indiana Jonesy, but obviously as she is in the comics, very I wouldn't even say morally grey. I don't think she's a terrible person, but she's not like Vader level where she's like a outright cold-blooded sadist murderer. She's just like, yeah, she'll kill someone if they're in her way, and she's very selfish. But I love her. I love 000. Just anytime you read his voice in like the 3PO Anthony Daniels voice, it's just like, I love draining humans. You know, my favorite thing is when they're screaming in horror and their eyes are falling out, and you're like, Jesus. I love it. I absolutely love it. I always recommend to people, I'm like, if you want to get into Star Wars comics, I think there's a 2017 Vader comics by Charles Soule, which are my personal favorite. And it's quite easy because it's like, you know who Vader is. It's just after Revenge of the Sith. It's just quite an easy into the comic realm. And I say to people with the main run of Star Wars comics, I found the 2015 ones between A New Hope and Empire, they were quite uneven. There's like 75 of them. And there's a couple of arcs that are phenomenal. There's the Ashes of Jeddah arc where they go to Jeddah after Rogue One, and I love that arc. And there's a few others that are really good, but they didn't land for me. However, the 2020 run by Charles Soule, which is, you know, much more about Lando and is between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I won't spoil it because by the sound of things you aren't at the end, but I really liked that. Getting to see Luke transition from who he was in Empire to Return of the Jedi and really seeing some of his weird Force adventures, as well as seeing Lando becoming more of a general and less of a smuggler. They're two of my favorite things. I really rate the current Star Wars run. Really do.
Yeah. Right now I'm up to right after the Dark Droids crossover. So I've read all the Dark Droids crossover, and I'm right after that is where I'm at right now.
You're not far from the end then, because there's it's one of those because I keep saying his name. I love Charles Soule, and I had him on the podcast only a few weeks ago to talk about Lucky Devils, which by the time this comes out, that'll be it. Issue 1 of Lucky Devils will be out January 8th, I think it is. So anyone listening, go check that out. What I found with the crossover events and stuff, there's War of the Bounty Hunters, Crimson Reign, and Hidden Empire. And I really enjoyed them. I thought they were cool, but I have read all of the crossover comics and stuff. And there are so many, especially when you're like trying to read the Afra series, and then she's in the same area that Luke is in. And it was cool to begin with, but I found that by sort of Crimson Reign, maybe Hidden Empire, I was like, I'm fine for not all of the comics to intertwine. And then Dark Droids came out, and, you know, I won't say anything that happens after that or anything, but like, I won't spoil it for any listeners, but I liked Dark Droids. I thought it was a really cool concept, and I enjoyed certain elements of it. But again, when I was reading where all of the comics were kind of intertwining with it, I was like, I like it, but also so much has happened in this year between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And I know that because it comes out, you know, several decades after the films, I know there's no way to the people in the films to say, oh yeah, when these droids attacked. But you think when the Dark Droids event happens, it's such a massive, like, universe, galaxy-wide event that occurs, even if it's only for a short period of time, and just no one mentions it. I'm like, I think is a bit much for me personally. But did you enjoy the crossover events, the 4 of them?
I think it was really fun to see get to see more of Kira, because I really liked Kira in the Solo movie, and so I really enjoyed getting to see more of her and how she became the leader of that was it Crimson Dawn or whatever. And I really enjoyed that a lot. The Dark Droids, I think I enjoyed maybe a little bit less, but I really enjoyed the that series of where R2-D2 was teaming up with some of the other droids and
D Squad.
that was a lot of fun. That was a ton of fun, that series.
That was so silly. Like, I do love it when Star Wars, it doesn't always land when Star Wars goes a bit goofier, but I do, especially in comic form, I do appreciate it. I'm always like, do it. We don't need a bit, as much as I like the Vader comics. And again, the Vader 2020 comics, I do rate, and I think there are a couple arcs, and I'm just a bit like, we kind of need to move on from this. I'm a bit bored, but some of the arcs are really cool. Like, there's the bit where he goes to, there's a certain planet, and he interacts with people who like grew up on Tatooine with him when he was a kid. And so I believe you've got there, because I think that's in the earlier on in the comics when he meets the handmaidens, like the remaining handmaidens, and then he meets, it's Wold and Kitster. So it's a Rhodian and a human, and it's the same kids that were there when he was building his pod racer, and Kitster, I think it is the human who says, That's a Wizard or something, or is something like that.
Yeah.
And when seeing them grown up interact with Vader, I love that. I'm a sucker for that kind of thing, because I was like, that's never something I never, ever, even being a prequel baby, even considered Walt or Kitster. I never thought about anyone on Tatooine outside of probably, at least the people we see in Tatooine in Phantom Menace, outside of Shmi, who we know her fate, Anakin, know her fate, and Watto, who I don't really care about. I didn't even think about those other people. So having those characters pop up, I was like, oh my God, that's so cool. And a Vader ride a pod racer in like a storm. I was like in a storm of sand as well.
Yeah, that was awesome. Yeah.
I love it. Are there any other comics you want to mention before we wrap up?
Well, I will say I really enjoyed the Poe Dameron series also. That was a really good one.
I didn't have high hopes for that, but I thought there was some really, really good stuff in there. And actually, one of my favorite characters is in that series, and it made me love him. I've got a Funko Pop of him that I got for Christmas, and it's Snap Wexley. He's I love Snap because he's in a book. He's in the Aftermath trilogy as a kid, and he's got this. He reprogrammed a B1 battle droid called Mr. Bones. And I don't know if you've read the Aftermath books, but Mr. Bones is a B1 battle droid, but he's basically got like I don't know what it is, his personality is crazy. So he's like singing, he has like blades coming out of his hands and stuff, and he just does anything that a young Snap, who's called Temmin when he's a kid, a young Snap tells him to do. And he like sings songs to himself while he's like gutting people. So he's like, and everyone's like this really weird droid, Mr. Bones, and he's like humming songs to himself and singing that I love the killing while like full on massacring people. And I'm like, I love it. I love crazy droids. I love things like that. And I love Snap. So seeing him in that was more. What did you like about the Poe Dameron comics? What did you like so much about them?
I don't know. I think a lot of the adventures they went on in that series were really fun and kind of unusual, and I kind of like getting to know some of the secondary characters a little bit better. That you very briefly see in the movies, but you don't really get to know them that much. Like Snap Wexley for one. I do think I have a greater appreciation for him also than a lot of other people do because of getting to know him in the comics better.
100%. And you get to see some space battles in the Poe Dameron comics too.
Yeah. But there was one other thing I wanted to mention too, real quick, about the current series, Skeleton Crew.
Yes, please do.
I really, really loved the latest episode 6.
With KB.
Because it really resonated with us, that conversation that she had with Wim when he was helping her to repair her, because it was like, and I know you mentioned it too in your conversation with Tanya about that, because I listened to that episode. It was a really good episode.
Thank you.
And you mentioned something about that it was good that they were talking about kind of like people judging other people about their disabilities and that kind of thing. But I really think I see that, but I also see that it's a little bit more nuanced than that, I think, because what I got from that whole conversation is that it seems like Fern was kind of like in denial about her friend's disability, because she mentioned that there was an accident that the reason why she was like this, and so it seemed like Fern knew her before the accident, and it seemed like Fern really had a hard time coping with the fact that her friend was different after the accident and wasn't able to do as much, and that really resonated with me, because there are some friends that I have sometimes that even though they know about my DID and are very accepting of it, they sometimes don't realize how much that DID affects my daily life and how difficult it is sometimes, because part of the thing is I don't always talk about that as much because I don't want to talk about my troubles too much with my friends, and I do sometimes, but I don't want to bog them down with too many of the minor details and everything, but sometimes people don't realize how much it affects like everything, like it's a lot of the reason why I a lot of times seem kind of spacey and out of it sometimes, and kind of forgetful, and a lot of that's because of the DID, just not just because of different alters coming out, but also because of dissociation in general, just the fact that we have the most severe form of dissociation, that means that the minor forms of dissociation, like daydreaming, come a lot easier to us, than they would for a normal person. So we have a lot harder time focusing a lot of times and stuff like that. And So a lot of times people don't realize how much that affects your life, and when other people are expecting you to be, like a quote unquote normal person, and it does it is difficult to kind of remind people of that, and sometimes it's easier to just not say anything and try to go along with what they think of you, and so it was really cool to see that aspect of that kind of dynamic portrayed in this Star Wars. I wasn't really expecting that them to get into that much detail of what it's like to have a disability or something like that your friends don't really totally understand or know how to cope with.
Yeah, that was very insightful, and thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, it is. I really like a lot of what Skeleton Crew is doing, but there's a very interesting point. It is, I think, when people, like, when you have friends who are going through stuff and you want to be the best friend that you can be, it's hard sometimes, isn't it? Because you're like, even with you, obviously with yourself having DID, that doesn't mean people around you don't have their own issues and problems and etc. And it's like, I've had friends who've really struggled with suicide and other things like that. And when they go through something like that and they come out the other side, it's always, you're uncertain. And I feel like I may have inadvertently in the past been a bit of a fern, which is, a friend of mine's gone through something quite intense. And then I'm like, do they want to talk about it? I'm not really sure. I can talk about it if they want to open the conversation, but I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable like they have to talk about it. So I just talk about something completely unrelated. And sometimes, and in the past, once or twice, that has come across like I'm not interested or I'm not, aware of the issues they're going through. And actually I was like, I just didn't want to make you have to talk about that. I didn't know if you want to just talk anything by escape. So I think it's really good learning for everyone, for people who are, whether when watching Skeleton Crew, they're going through some stuff, or if in the future they will, or in the past, it works on both sides. It works for if you've gone through something like that and your friend maybe hasn't acted in the best way, it kind of shows this might be why, but also if you're a person and you've got someone close to you who's going through something like that, it can be quite a good thing to just be a bit more aware of. And that's what I think one of the beauties of the lessons in Skeleton Crew. None of it's like an after school special, which is like, and that's kids, why we shouldn't do that. Don't do this after that. And remember to brush your teeth. It's nothing like that. It's a lot of the character dynamics are nuanced and subtle enough that you can really delve deep and have certain perceptions and like interpretations of them. But at their core, they mean in broad strokes the same kind of thing. And they're still giving lessons to, adults as well, but also to kids. And I just think it's doing it so well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love the fact too that later in that same episode, when they get back together again and Fern realizes that she was wrong and apologizes to KB, and that was really nice too, that they showed that, the fairing of their relationship. And
apologizing is so important as well, especially something the kids need to learn, because a lot of adults and parents especially feel like admitting they were wrong is a weakness when obviously it's not, it's a strength. And so I think that's a really important thing as well. It's such a great show, and I'm so many people are enjoying it, and myself included, and it's just a really fun ride. It's not necessarily my favorite Star Wars show, but it's just fun, and I'm just really here for the ride, and I just love it. It's that childlike wonder. That's what I want from Star Wars sometimes. I liked Acolyte a lot. There's a lot of things I like about it. Love Andor, but I don't want all Star Wars to be Andor. I love it to pieces, but it's very intense and it's a lot to deal with. Sometimes with Skeleton Crew, it's like, let's just go on a fun adventure with some lessons along the way. And I'm like, I'm in.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Douglas, it's been fantastic speaking with you about Star Wars and nerdy things. And thank you for telling us a bit more about sort of DID and your perspective on those things. Is there anything else you want to mention before we hang this call up?
Nothing I can think of.
Easy peasy. I'll put details in the description of where people can find you, and I'll also link to my conversations with Lena, with Louise, and also with Lena's appearance on Indie Comic Spotlight with Tony, speaking about elves. And also, I know that Lena occasionally pops up on Into the Night, the Moon Knight podcast as well, so I'll pop that in there. And if there's anything else you want me to put in the description or mention to people, as well as obviously I'll put your X account on there, and your other social media. If there's anything else you want me to add in there, please do. But, just thank you so much for making time, coming on the show. And it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show.